My son locked me in prison for 2 years, so I bought his entire world. The heavy steel gate slammed shut behind me. To me, it smelled like absolute freedom. I looked down at my clothes. I was wearing the exact same charcoal gray tailored suit I had worn on the day of my criminal trial, the day the judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel and stripped away my life, my reputation, and my freedom. It was the pure, unadulterated rage that consumed me from the inside out. I learned very quickly that rage burns significantly more calories than any treadmill ever could. I stood on the cracked concrete sidewalk holding absolutely nothing. I had no duffel bag, no personal effects, and no cell phone. I had nothing but the damp clothes on my back and an inferno burning in my gut. I saw them long before they saw me. A sleek, brand-new silver Bentley pulled smoothly up to the curb, intentionally splashing a puddle of dirty rainwater directly onto my leather shoes. It was subtle, passive-aggressive, and entirely on brand for my son. The heavy rear door opened, and Preston stepped out into the rain. My son, but the smile was not directed at me, it was directed entirely at the cameras. I had not noticed them hiding in the shadows at first. It was a carefully orchestrated redemption arc, designed exclusively for the company newsletter to keep the fragile stock prices stable. Preston walked toward me with a wide, theatrical stride. He opened his arms wide to the world, making sure the angle was perfect for the flashing cameras. He leaned in close, his freshly shaved cheek brushing against mine. His breath smelled of expensive peppermint and freshly ground artisanal coffee. "Smile, Dad," he whispered. His voice was a venomous hiss that the distant microphones could not possibly pick up. "Do not look so pathetic and miserable. The corporate shareholders are watching the live feed. If the company stock drops a single point because you look like a deranged convict, I will personally cut your monthly commissary fund down to absolute zero." I did not flinch. I simply stared straight ahead at the wet pavement, my face an unreadable mask of stone. Then came Tiffany. Her blonde hair was styled flawlessly. Her makeup was immaculate despite the rain, and in her arms, she held a small bundle wrapped tightly in expensive blue cashmere. She walked up to us, the sharp heels of her designer shoes clicking loudly on the wet concrete. Her eyes were completely dry, completely devoid of genuine emotion, but her face was contorted into a flawless, practiced mask of deep, familial concern. "Look who is finally here, Harlan," she cooed loudly. Her voice was sickeningly sweet, like thick syrup laced with deadly arsenic. "This is little Leo, your new grandson. He has been waiting so patiently to meet you." She aggressively shoved the wrapped bundle toward my face. She desperately needed the photograph of the repentant, crying grandfather holding the new corporate heir. I did not raise my hands. The paparazzi cameras clicked furiously in the background, capturing the cold, undeniable rejection in high definition. Preston immediately stepped directly in front of me, aggressively blocking my path to the street. His face turned a dangerous shade of red, the veins in his neck bulging against his stiff white collar. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed through tightly gritted teeth, his public facade slipping for a fraction of a second. "Get in the damn car. We have a massive press dinner planned." I did not say a single word. I simply walked around him. He looked deeply exhausted, the dark bags under his eyes prominent even from a distance. But he was there. True loyalty is incredibly rare these days, rarer than solid gold. I heard Preston's heavy footsteps splashing aggressively through the puddles behind me. They were the hands of a spoiled man who had never done a single day of grueling physical labor in his entire life. "Dad, stop making a pathetic scene," Preston growled, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. "You are embarrassing us in front of the press. Get in the Bentley right now." I stopped walking. I turned back around and continued my slow, deliberate walk toward the black Ford. Garrett quickly opened the heavy back door for me. To me, it smelled exactly like safety. As Garrett firmly closed the heavy car door behind me, I heard Preston absolutely lose his mind on the sidewalk. His carefully constructed public mask had completely shattered. "You are a crazy, senile old man," he yelled at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking wildly in the damp air. "You have absolutely nowhere to go. The massive house is legally mine. The entire logistics company is legally mine. You have absolutely nothing left. Do you hear me? You are completely homeless." I watched silently through the rain-streaked window as my son stood there in his rapidly soaking expensive suit, getting thoroughly drenched to the bone. Tiffany was frantically pulling at his arm, desperately trying to hide her face from the flashing cameras of the paparazzi they had hired. I sat back into the worn leather seat and slowly closed my eyes. "I am not homeless," I whispered quietly to myself as the heavy engine of the Ford roared to life. "I am just returning from a long business trip, and I am coming to take absolutely everything back." Garrett did not say a single word as he pulled the old sedan away from the curb. For the very first time in 2 solid years, the air I breathed did not smell of harsh industrial disinfectant, unwashed bodies, and total despair. Garrett finally cleared his throat. It was the distinct look of a man who had been desperately holding back a massive avalanche with nothing but a small plastic spoon. "You look absolutely terrible, Harlan," Garrett said quietly, his eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror. "I feel fantastic," I lied effortlessly. My entire body was aching from the damp cold, and the oversized suit felt like it was hanging off a fragile skeleton. But my mind was sharper and faster than it had been in decades. Prison does that to a man who refuses to break. It violently strips away all of life's meaningless distractions. There are no corporate golf games, no tedious board meetings, and no lavish charity galas. There is just time, endless, agonizing time to think, time to hate, and time to meticulously plan. "Tell me the exact damage," I said, cutting straight through the pleasantries. Garrett let out a long, heavy sigh. He reached over into his worn leather briefcase resting on the passenger seat and pulled out a remarkably thick manila folder. He handed it back to me without turning his head. "It is bad, Harlan," he said softly over the sound of the rain. "It is significantly worse than we initially thought." I opened the heavy folder. The massive trust fund I had carefully set up for the loyal employees' pension plan was completely drained dry. "He is bleeding the beast completely dry," Garrett said, his voice laced with disgust. "He violently sold off the entire logistics fleet in the Southern District. He aggressively outsourced all of our shipping and trucking routes to a cheap third-party vendor. A vendor, I might add, that is conveniently owned entirely by one of Tiffany's distant cousins." I felt a cold, calculated rage settle deep into the center of my chest, but I did not let a single emotion show on my face. I calmly turned the page. "What about the main corporate headquarters?" I asked softly. "The massive skyscraper downtown, that is the absolute only thing left," Garrett replied, shaking his head. "It is the last remaining crown jewel. He frantically tried to sell the building last month to a massive commercial developer from Dubai. But the strict historical zoning laws you cleverly put in place 20 years ago made the sale incredibly difficult. He couldn't find a single corporate buyer who wanted to deal with the suffocating historical preservation restrictions." "Good," I whispered, a dark sense of satisfaction washing over me. "At least the boy is completely incompetent." Garrett hesitated. The old sedan slowed down as we approached a red traffic light. The heavy rain drummed rhythmically against the metal roof. "There is something else, Harlan," Garrett said, and I heard his voice actually tremble slightly. "Something I just found out 3 days ago. Preston was incredibly desperate. The volatile crypto market completely crashed last week. He lost tens of millions of the company's operating cash playing digital roulette. He needed massive liquidity immediately to cover the massive employee payroll and keep the aggressive creditors at bay." I closed the heavy folder and rested it on my lap. I knew exactly where this conversation was going. "Who did he borrow the money from?" I asked calmly. "He went to a very dark private equity firm," Garrett said, gripping the steering wheel. "A ruthless shadow lender called Nemesis Corporation. They are absolute sharks, Harlan, the very worst kind in the industry. They specialize exclusively in hostile takeovers of distressed corporate assets. They gave him a massive bridge loan of $12 million in pure cash. The compound interest rate is entirely predatory. It is practically criminal." I looked quietly out the window. The gray city was passing by in a wet, blurred smear. "And the collateral?" I asked, though I already knew the exact answer. Garrett gripped the wheel even tighter. "Total control," he said. "He pledged his entire block of executive voting rights. If he misses a single weekly payment, or if the company's overall credit rating drops below a C grade for even 1 hour, Nemesis Corporation has the absolute legal right to completely seize his shares, terminate him, and take immediate, hostile control of the entire board of directors. He signed his own corporate death warrant. Harlan, these people do not play games. If they take over, the company is entirely gone. They will aggressively strip it for parts. I sat back deep into the leather seat and let a small, completely dry smile touch the edges of my lips. Garrett saw the expression in the rearview mirror and frowned deeply. "Why in the world are you smiling?" he asked, sounding genuinely offended by my lack of panic. "Did you hear a single word I just said? Your idiot son just handed the literal keys to your empire to a bunch of ruthless corporate raiders. We need to file an emergency federal injunction immediately. We need to find a way to pay off that massive loan before the very first payment is due next week." I chuckled. It was a rough, rusty, terrifying sound that I hadn't used in 2 years. "We will do absolutely no such thing," I said smoothly. Garrett slammed his foot aggressively on the brakes as the light turned red. He turned entirely around in his seat to face me, absolute shock written vividly all over his tired face. "Are you completely insane?" he demanded loudly. "If Nemesis takes over, you lose absolutely everything too. Your life's legacy, the massive logistics company you built from the ground up with a single rusted truck, it will all be gone forever." I leaned forward slowly, resting my forearms gracefully on the back of the front seat. "Garrett," I said quietly, my voice dropping an octave. "Who exactly do you think secretly owns Nemesis Corporation?" Garrett stared blankly at me. He blinked rapidly, profound confusion washing over him. "I don't know," he stammered. "It is an incredibly complex shell company legally registered in the Cayman Islands. The corporate paperwork is buried deeply under a dozen layers of ironclad anonymity. It is completely impossible to trace the true owner." "Not impossible," I said softly. "Just incredibly difficult." I reached deep into the pocket of my oversized suit and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of cheap paper. It was a standard receipt from the prison commissary, but on the back, I had meticulously written a long series of complex offshore account numbers. 2 years is a very long time to sit in a concrete box, Garrett," I said. "You loyally brought me thick books. You brought me yellow legal pads. But you also brought me unfettered access. Do you remember that brilliant forensic accountant you explicitly hired for me? The one you incorrectly thought was just reviewing my criminal appeal case." Garrett's eyes widened to the size of saucers. "I had him legally set up Nemesis Corporation over 6 months ago," I continued, enjoying the absolute shock on his face. "I secretly liquidated all of my massive offshore accounts, the hidden accounts Preston had absolutely no idea existed. The massive emergency fund Beatrice and I quietly saved for a rainy day. And looking out the window, it seems it is raining quite heavily today." "You," Garrett whispered, the color draining from his face. "You are Nemesis," I nodded slowly. "I am the shark, Garrett. I lent my arrogant son the exact rope he is going to use to publicly hang himself. He arrogantly thinks he borrowed $12 million from a faceless, ruthless corporation. He has absolutely no idea he borrowed it directly from the father he betrayed and locked in a cage." Garrett slowly slumped back into his driver's seat. He let out a long, incredibly shaky breath. He looked genuinely terrified of me, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I felt a tiny twinge of guilt, but it vanished instantly. "So," Garrett said, his voice barely audible over the rain, "we completely own the debt. We have absolute control over the loan. We can aggressively call it in right now. We can walk directly into that corporate boardroom tomorrow morning and legally tell him he is entirely finished." I shook my head side to side. "No," I said, my voice cold. "Not yet. Why not?" Garrett asked frantically, "Why wait a single second?" "Because profound pain is an incredible teacher," I said, looking back out at the heavy rain. "And Preston has not learned his lesson yet. If I strike right now, he will immediately play the victim. He will cry to the media that he was just having a bad fiscal quarter. He will blame the volatile market. He desperately needs to believe he is perfectly safe. He needs to truly think the massive cash injection from Nemesis permanently saved his lifestyle." I paused, watching a single heavy drop of water trace a jagged path down the cold glass. Let him eagerly spend the money, I said. Let him arrogantly buy Tiffany another massive diamond necklace. Let him think he has completely won the war. Let him climb even higher, Garrett, because the fall only kills you if you plummet from a truly spectacular height. When he feels completely untouchable, when his massive arrogance is at its absolute peak, that is the exact moment we trigger the ruthless default clause. That is when I take absolutely everything back. Garrett slowly turned back to the steering wheel. The traffic light turned green. He put the car in gear, but I could clearly see his hands were shaking slightly. "You are a very scary man, Harlan," he said quietly. "I was a very good man once," I replied softly, "but good men do not survive in a maximum security prison, and they certainly do not survive the betrayal of this family." I sat back, closing my eyes, vividly visualizing the absolute terror on Preston's face when the massive hammer finally fell. And Preston, my own flesh and blood, had become a malignant tumor that was actively killing my life's legacy. "Where to?" Garrett asked, his voice slowly returning to its sharp professional tone. I opened my eyes. The fire in my gut was burning hotter and brighter than ever before. "Take me home," I said coldly. "Take me directly to the mansion. I want to see exactly what they have done to my beautiful house, and I want them to look out the window and see that the angry ghost has returned to aggressively haunt them." The towering iron gates of Ford Manor rose up before us like the jagged teeth of a giant, sleeping beast. I had personally installed these massive gates over 30 years ago to keep the dangerous world out and to aggressively protect my growing family. But as Garrett brought the old sedan to a halt in front of the glowing call box, I sharply realized the iron beast was now guarding the monsters inside from me. The heavy rain was still falling, drumming a relentless, deafening rhythm against the roof. I looked up at the towering stone pillars. My carved initials, HF, were still deeply etched into the solid granite, but I knew with absolute certainty that inside that walled compound, my name had been violently scrubbed from existence. Garrett smoothly rolled down the window. The cold, wet air rushed in. It was a hired goon. "Cheap private security. State your business," the aggressive voice barked. "This is Garrett Hale, senior legal counsel for Harlan Ford." "Open the gate immediately." There was a very long pause, heavy and entirely deliberate. Then the voice returned, dripping with open mockery. "Mr. Ford does not legally reside here anymore. We have strict, explicit orders from the owner. No trespassers allowed. Turn the vehicle around immediately, or we will forcefully call the authorities." I felt a massive muscle in my jaw jump violently. It was meticulously designed to recognize my unique print in less than a fraction of a second. I pressed my thumb against the wet glass and waited patiently for the familiar green light. Instead, a harsh, flashing red light violently illuminated the darkness. "Access denied." I pressed it again, much harder. "Access denied." They had completely deleted my existence from the mainframe. And for a brief, terrifying moment, the rage was so incredibly blinding, I genuinely wanted to tear the metal scanner straight off the stone wall with my bare hands. Then, the piercing sirens started. They were close. She had undoubtedly been waiting for this exact moment, watching intently from the massive second-floor window like a venomous spider resting in a web. Bright blue and red lights flashed violently against the wet pavement as two heavily marked patrol cars screeched to a sudden halt directly behind Garrett's Ford. 4 doors flew open simultaneously. 4 armed officers stepped out into the storm, their hands hovering dangerously over their heavy holsters. I turned very slowly to face them. "Do not speak a single word unless spoken to. Step away from the gate." The lead officer shouted loudly over the storm. He looked young, deeply terrified, and incredibly dangerous. "Put your hands high in the air right now." I raised my hands very slowly. The freezing rain quickly soaked straight through my suit, chilling me completely to the bone. "I am completely unarmed," I said, my voice projecting a calm authority that sharply contrasted the violent storm raging inside me. "This is my personal house. We have a frantic 911 call reporting an active attempted break-in and a direct violation of a restraining order." The officer yelled, advancing aggressively on me. "Turn around immediately. Put your hands flat on the wall." I did exactly as I was told. I felt the freezing, rough stone tear against my exposed palms. The aggressive officer patted me down quickly. his hands incredibly rough and deeply intrusive. I looked up toward the massive house. She was pointing an accusatory finger directly at me. "That is him," she shrieked, her dramatic voice carrying easily over the roaring wind. "He is absolutely crazy. He violently threatened to kill us if we did not let him inside. He is highly dangerous. Arrest him immediately." And then, standing high above her, on the sprawling second-floor balcony, the heavy French doors opened. It was a massive smile of pure, unadulterated, sickening triumph. "Take the pathetic trash away, officers." Preston called down loudly, his arrogant voice slurring slightly from the alcohol. "He is aggressively trespassing on highly private property, and he is a violently convicted felon. We do not feel safe in our own home." The officer grabbed my right wrist, violently, forcefully pulling it behind my back. Was I going straight back to a concrete cell before I had even spent a single night as a free man? "Wait." The voice was incredibly sharp and deeply authoritative. Garrett stepped out of his car into the torrential downpour. He was confidently holding a massive black binder high in the air, completely oblivious to the freezing rain aggressively ruining his suit. "Officer, if you snap those steel cuffs on his wrists, you will personally be facing a massive federal lawsuit for wrongful arrest and a severe civil rights violation before the sun even goes down." The young officer paused in his tracks, the heavy steel cuff dangling uselessly from one of my wrists. He looked nervously at Garrett, then up at the arrogant Preston, then back down at me. "Who exactly are you?" the officer asked aggressively. "I am his senior legal attorney," Garrett said, walking confidently forward with a massive presence that made the armed police instinctively step back. "And you are currently acting on completely false and malicious information. My client is not trespassing. He is standing in his own home." Preston laughed loudly from the balcony. It was a hollow, deeply nervous sound. "Do not listen to a single word he says." Preston shouted angrily, "I legally own the master deed. The entire title is legally in my name. I have the certified papers to prove it. That crazy old man has absolutely no legal rights here." Garrett did not even look up. He walked straight to the lead officer and aggressively flipped open the heavy binder to a specific page, marked with a bright yellow sticky note. He tapped the dense legal paragraph aggressively with his index finger. "Read this very carefully," Garrett commanded. The officer squinted heavily through the driving rain. He looked up at the massive house, then back down at the legal document. "What exactly does this mean?" the officer asked, clearly confused. "It is an ironclad life estate clause," Garrett explained, his voice booming loud enough for Preston to clearly hear. "When Harlan's late wife, Beatrice Ford, legally transferred the property title to the corporate trust that Preston currently controls, she cleverly included an absolutely non-negotiable stipulation, Clause 4A. Regardless of future ownership, title transfer, or familial dispute, Harlan Ford permanently retains the exclusive, irrevocable legal right to permanently reside in the primary master suite of this property for the entire duration of his natural life. This fundamental right cannot be severed by sale, aggressive transfer, or hostile eviction." I slowly lowered my hands. The officer did absolutely nothing to stop me. "It legally means," Garrett continued, snapping the heavy binder shut with a loud crack, "that while Preston may legally own the expensive bricks and the mortar, Harlan legally owns the absolute right to stand anywhere he damn well pleases inside those massive gates. If you illegally arrest him for trespassing, you are literally arresting a man for standing inside his own living room." The silence that immediately followed was incredibly heavy. The only sound was the relentless rain and the distant, rolling thunder. I turned slowly to look up at the balcony. She stood frozen on the porch, her mouth slightly open in utter shock. "Officer," I said quietly, calmly brushing the cold rainwater off my wet lapel, "I would very much like to go inside and dry off. My arrogant son seems to have conveniently forgotten the security code to the front gate. Would you kindly mind aggressively asking him to open it? Or should I immediately press severe federal charges for an illegal eviction attempt?" The officer looked at me closely, then looked back at the certified document again. He turned his face aggressively toward the high balcony. "Mr. Ford," the officer shouted angrily at Preston, "open the damn gate!" "What?" Preston yelled back in a panic. "No, He is highly dangerous. The legal document is completely valid, sir, the officer replied coldly, his right hand resting casually on his heavy baton. Open the gate immediately, or we will physically cut the lock, and I will be forced to aggressively cite you for intentionally obstructing a legal resident's access. Do not make me come up there. Preston violently slammed his crystal drink down on the railing. The expensive glass shattered completely, raining sharp shards down onto the stone patio below. He turned and stormed furiously back inside, leaving the heavy doors wide open. A moment later, the glowing red light on the biometric scanner turned a bright, welcoming green. The massive heavy iron gates groaned loudly and began to swing slowly open. I nodded respectfully to the officer. Thank you for your excellent service, I said. I walked slowly past the security guard booth. The hired goon kept his head completely down, pretending to be incredibly busy with his cell phone. It was absolutely everywhere. Preston desperately wanted the high social status of the mansion, but he had absolutely no interest in the grueling work required to maintain it. Garrett slowly drove the sedan up the driveway behind me, but I kept walking entirely on foot. I wanted to enter the domain on foot. I wanted them to clearly hear my heavy footsteps approaching. I finally reached the massive front porch, but she had confidently played her absolute best ace, and I had effortlessly trumped it. I walked aggressively up the stone steps. She desperately tried to hold my cold gaze, desperately tried to muster that incredibly arrogant sneer she had confidently worn in the courtroom, but she completely faltered. She looked down at her feet. You absolutely cannot stay here, she hissed venomously, her voice trembling slightly. We will make your life a living hell. You will beg to be back in prison. I looked right past her, gazing through the open front door. Now they were incredibly heavy velvet, dyed a deep, aggressive crimson. I looked back at Tiffany. I stepped in incredibly close, invading her personal space just enough to make her physically flinch. I have been living in actual hell for 2 solid years, Tiffany, I said softly, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I actually found it quite comfortable. I brushed aggressively past her, my heavy shoulder intentionally checking hers, forcefully making her stumble back violently in her high heels. I turned back to look at her one final time before I closed the door on the outside world. I see you redecorated the place, I said coldly, gesturing to the grand salon. You aggressively changed the curtains to a deep red. Tiffany glared at me with pure hatred, her hands tightly balled into small fists. So what? She spat angrily. I smiled, and for the very first time that incredibly long day, it was a genuinely real smile. Good choice, I said quietly. The color of fresh blood suits you. I turned and walked slowly toward the sweeping stairs, leaving her standing alone in the cold, wet wind. I was firmly inside. The angry enemy was within the walls, and the hunt had officially begun. The heavy silence inside the sprawling manor was not the peaceful, comforting silence I vividly remembered from years past. It was a deeply suffocating, toxic quiet, the exact kind of heavy silence that hangs ominously in the air just before a massive tornado touches down and rips a town apart. I walked slowly through the grand hallway, my heavy footsteps echoing loudly on the cold marble floor. It was the highly secure room where I had smoked expensive cigars with state senators and confidently signed massive contracts that literally changed the skyline of the city. I finally reached the massive double oak doors. It was entirely too light, entirely too hollow. I stepped inside the room and stopped absolutely dead in my tracks. My breath hitched painfully in my throat. Everything was completely gone. My massive, hand-carved mahogany desk, which I had specially commissioned and imported from Italy 20 years ago, was entirely missing. The comforting, familiar smell of aged paper and rich tobacco had been completely replaced by the sharp, stinging scent of cheap rubber and aggressive lemon disinfectant. Mirrors. They had completely covered every single wall in massive, floor-to-ceiling mirrors. I stared blankly at my own reflection. Where I used to carefully review complex quarterly reports by the fire, there was a massive rack of heavy dumbbells and a bright pink yoga mat. They had entirely destroyed my strategic war room and turned it into a generic fitness gym. Tiffany's personal gym. I saw a damp pink towel thrown completely carelessly over a heavy bench press. They were actively trying to scrub me entirely out of the rich history of this massive house. I turned quickly away from the horrible mirrors. I absolutely could not bear to look at what I had physically become in this room that used to define my total power. I desperately needed to find my valuable things, my private books, my secure papers, but most importantly, Beatrice. Beatrice's beautiful oil portrait. She was beautifully wearing her absolute favorite blue dress, smiling that incredibly soft, deeply knowing smile that used to effortlessly calm my absolute worst storms. I looked desperately at the stone fireplace. The large space directly above the grand mantel was entirely empty, just a massive, sterile white void. Panic, incredibly cold and incredibly sharp, forcefully pierced right through my heavy anger. If they had callously thrown my entire life away, this cold, forgotten area is exactly where the tragic debris would have landed. I violently tore open the door to the dark maintenance closet. A single naked bulb flickered weakly to life, casting incredibly long, aggressively dancing shadows against the massive clutter. And right there it was, piled completely carelessly, in a dark corner like absolute garbage, were dozens of heavy cardboard boxes, filled with my private files and my prestigious awards. The golden key to the city I had proudly received 10 years ago was lying completely face down in a filthy puddle of water, leaking directly from a rusty iron pipe. But I absolutely did not care about the city key. I frantically dug through the massive pile, aggressively tossing aside heavy bronze plaques and crystal trophies. Then my eyes locked onto the corner of a heavy gold frame. I pulled it out incredibly slowly. My hands were violently trembling. It was Beatrice, but the beautiful canvas was horrifically torn. Disgusting green mold was actively starting to bloom right on the delicate corner of her beautifully painted blue dress. I sank directly to my knees on the freezing cold concrete floor. I frantically pulled a clean white handkerchief from my pocket and desperately tried to wipe away the filthy dirt and the aggressive mold. "I am so incredibly sorry," I whispered, my voice completely cracking in the empty, damp room. "I am so sorry, B. I absolutely should have been here. I should have aggressively protected you." I held the damaged frame incredibly tight against my chest, slowly rocking back and forth. That was an explicit, undeniable declaration of total war. I stayed in that freezing closet for a very long time, meticulously cleaning every single inch of the heavy frame until it was as clean as I could possibly make it. She was coming right back to the light. I carefully carried the heavy painting directly into the main living room. Heavy, deeply arrogant footsteps. Well, look who is already making himself entirely at home. I turned around incredibly slowly. He confidently held a heavy glass of expensive scotch in one hand. I did not answer him at all. I just stood firmly right in front of the beautiful portrait, aggressively shielding it with my body. Preston walked arrogantly into the room, his eyes scanning the space until they firmly landed on the painting. He scoffed loudly. "I genuinely thought we completely threw that dusty old thing out into the trash," he said, taking a casual sip of his expensive drink. "It really aggressively clashes with the modern new decor. Tiffany absolutely hates it. She says it is deeply depressing. It is your own mother," I said, my voice incredibly low and perfectly steady. "It is a dusty, irrelevant old picture," Preston countered, waving his hand dismissively. "But fine, strictly keep it locked in your bedroom. Just keep it completely out of sight. We have incredibly important guests coming tonight. Extremely wealthy investors. I absolutely do not want them seeing my senile father acting like a crazed janitor, carrying actual trash around the house." He reached casually into his back pocket and aggressively pulled out a thick gold money clip. He peeled off a few bills and violently tossed them directly onto the glass coffee table right between us. They fluttered down pathetically like dead leaves. "Here," Preston said arrogantly, $500. That is your entire pathetic allowance for the month. Do not aggressively spend it all on cheap candy." I looked down at the money, then I looked straight at him. "Allowance?" I repeated coldly. "Yeah," Preston sneered confidently. "You have absolutely zero income. You have zero pension. I completely froze all of your personal accounts. Remember? Consider this absolute charity. Go confidently buy yourself a brand new shirt. That Baga suit aggressively smells like a dirty prison." He took another long sip of his scotch. "And tonight, do me a massive favor. Stay entirely in your room. Do not aggressively come downstairs. Do not confidently embarrass me in front of the board." He waited eagerly for me to absolutely explode. He deeply wanted me to aggressively yell, to violently throw the dirty money right back in his face. He desperately wanted to definitively prove to himself that I was the deeply unstable, incredibly violent man he had falsely painted me to be in federal court. I took a deep, incredibly slow breath. I calmly picked up the scattered bills. 500, I said quietly, deliberately counting them incredibly slowly. I looked directly up at him and explicitly forced an incredibly small, painfully tight smile. Thank you, son, I said. This is incredibly generous of you. Preston blinked rapidly. He looked incredibly disappointed. He had completely lost the psychological fight he was craving. Yeah, well, he mumbled, abruptly turning away. Just stay completely out of the damn way. He walked aggressively out of the room, arrogantly taking his drink with him. I quietly pocketed the cash. Thank you, son, I whispered intensely to the entirely empty room. This exact money will explicitly buy me a phenomenal front-row seat to your absolute funeral. I turned my intense attention directly to the massive oak desk, sitting in the far corner of the living room. It was the single remaining piece of my original expensive furniture they had kept, highly likely because it was simply too incredibly heavy to physically move. It was the exact desk where Preston now sat arrogantly to confidently sign the massive corporate checks he had absolutely no fundamental right to sign. Reached completely into the deep inner pocket of my tailored jacket. I had quietly acquired it from an incredible contact on the inside, a dangerous man who used to work for federal intelligence before he tragically ended up in cell block. D.I. knelt down very quietly on the floor. I tapped it exactly once to ensure it was completely secure. Enjoy your expensive party, Preston, I said incredibly softly. Speak very loudly. I want to clearly hear every single lie. I stood up slowly, carefully picked up Beatrice's beautiful portrait, and walked quietly toward the main stairs. And tonight, I would listen intently. I spent the entire next hour explicitly in the massive guest room bathroom, aggressively scrubbing the filthy prison grime completely off my skin until it was incredibly raw and bright red. I carefully shaved off the thick gray stubble, finally revealing the incredibly sharp, rigid jawline that had successfully intimidated powerful union leaders and aggressive corporate raiders for over 40 years. Deep in the back of the dark cedar closet, carefully wrapped in a heavy garment bag that Tiffany had evidently completely missed during her massive purge, I finally found it. It looked exactly like incredibly expensive armor. I stood completely straight in front of the full-length mirror. Brilliant founder, ruthless CEO, and apex predator. I carefully adjusted my gold knot cufflinks, priceless cufflinks that I had meticulously hidden deep in the toe of an incredibly old shoe before the raid. I double-checked the tiny listening device completely hidden in my pocket to confidently make sure it was entirely secure. Then I slowly opened the door. Downstairs, the massive house was literally vibrating violently with the elegant sound of an expensive string quartet and the arrogant murmur of 50 incredibly wealthy voices desperately trying to sound incredibly important. I could deeply smell the ridiculously expensive, catering-heavy truffle oil and perfectly seared scallops. The explicit scent of massive amounts of money. I walked completely confidently to the top of the grand sweeping staircase. And standing exactly in the center, arrogantly holding court, was Preston. He was incredibly loud, my own mother's priceless necklace. I felt a massive spike of dangerous adrenaline, but I forcefully commanded my racing heart rate to go completely down. Stay completely cold, Harlan. Stay entirely cold. I began to slowly descend the sweeping stairs. I did not rush at all. I took precisely one incredibly slow step at a time, my hands sliding gracefully down the polished mahogany banister. The loud conversation in the massive foyer did not completely stop all at once. The incredibly expensive string quartet slowly trailed off into a deeply awkward, terrifying silence. Preston stared aggressively up at me, his mouth completely open. He had completely failed to prepare them for the sudden, dramatic return of the actual king. I confidently reached the very bottom step. The massive crowd completely parted entirely on instinct, immediately creating a very wide path specifically for me. I walked incredibly straight to a passing caterer, elegantly took a crystal glass of champagne, and raised it incredibly slightly directly toward my terrified son. Good evening, absolutely everyone, I said, my deep voice aggressively projecting completely effortlessly to the absolute back of the massive room. I sincerely hope you are incredibly enjoying my beautiful home. A few wealthy people murmured incredibly uncomfortable, confused greetings. Preston violently recovered his composure first. He quickly handed his scotch aggressively to Tiffany and marched furiously directly over to me. An incredibly forced, panicked smile plastered violently on his face that absolutely did not reach his terrified eyes. "Dad," he said, his voice incredibly tight, "I explicitly thought you were deeply resting. You know the expensive doctor completely said you desperately need your sleep." I took a slow, casual sip of the champagne. It was incredibly cheap. Preston was desperately cutting massive costs on the incredibly expensive catering too. "I felt incredibly energized, son," I replied smoothly, looking completely past him directly at the wealthy investors. "It would be incredibly rude of me to absolutely not warmly welcome your lovely guests. After all, I have been completely away on a massive government-sponsored sabbatical for quite some time." A deeply nervous, incredibly awkward ripple of quiet laughter completely went right through the crowded room. Preston grabbed my elbow aggressively, his incredibly soft fingers digging violently into my arm. "Go exactly back upstairs," he aggressively hissed directly in my ear. "You are completely ruining this entire event." Before I could aggressively answer, Tiffany quickly stepped confidently forward. She placed a soft hand directly on my chest, her manicured fingers splayed aggressively like a venomous spider. "Oh, Harlan," she sighed incredibly loudly, ensuring absolutely everyone in the quiet room could hear. "It is incredibly brave of you to confidently come downstairs. We were all just telling absolutely everyone how incredibly much you have deeply struggled ever since the tragic incident." She explicitly let the loaded word hang violently in the heavy air. The incident, the exact code word for the massive lie that had completely sent me directly to federal prison. The entire room went entirely, deadly silent. The wealthy investors aggressively leaned completely in, entirely hungry for the incredibly juicy gossip. Tiffany completely turned to the captive crowd, her eyes shimmering violently, with perfectly executed fake tears. "You all absolutely know the massive tragedy our poor family faced," she said, her voice completely trembling perfectly. "When I tragically lost the precious baby, it was an incredibly dark time. And poor Harlan here, his fragile mind completely snapped under the stress. He absolutely did not intentionally mean to violently hurt me. We completely know that now. The harsh prison was incredibly hard on him, but we are absolutely glad to have him safely back, exactly where we can deeply take care of him, even if he aggressively gets deeply confused sometimes." She patted my cheek completely condescendingly. They looked completely at me with deep, pathetic pity. I absolutely did not pull away. I completely let her hand rest exactly on my cheek. I looked her entirely dead, directly in the eye. "You are completely right, Tiffany," I said, my voice incredibly calm and perfectly steady. "My aging memory has absolutely been incredibly foggy lately. Heavy prison entirely does that to a man. You have absolutely so incredibly much time to intensely think about the complete past, to deeply replay absolutely every single tiny detail." I took exactly one aggressive step incredibly closer to her, violently forcing her to completely step backward. "But there is exactly one specific thing I have been actively trying to remember," I continued incredibly smoothly, actively addressing the absolutely entire room now. "And absolutely maybe you can explicitly help me, Tiffany, since you were completely there." I intentionally paused. The massive tension in the massive room was completely thick enough to deeply choke on. "That exact night on the grand stairs," I said, my voice booming, "when you tragically fell completely down and we violently lost the beautiful baby. Was it absolutely a boy or an incredibly beautiful girl?" Tiffany completely froze, her beautiful smile totally faltered. "What?" she stammered completely, her eyes darting violently. "The baby," I repeated completely innocently. "I absolutely never actively saw the medical certificate. Preston completely never explicitly told me. Was I absolutely going to have a beautiful grandson or a beautiful granddaughter?" Tiffany frantically looked entirely at Preston. Preston nervously looked completely down at his incredibly expensive shoes. It was completely a boy," she said incredibly quickly, her voice trembling. A beautiful little boy. We were completely going to proudly name him exactly after Preston. She dabbed completely at her incredibly dry eyes entirely with a silk napkin. A boy, I said, slowly nodding my head in complete understanding. That is incredibly beautiful, a strong son. I took absolutely another casual sip of cheap champagne and completely lowered the glass. That is absolutely strange, though. I casually reached entirely into the deep inside pocket of my tailored tuxedo. It was actually just a completely irrelevant laundry list, exactly from the federal prison, but I confidently held it exactly like it was an absolute death sentence. Because my incredibly expensive lawyer completely sent me the massive medical files directly from St. Jude's Hospital just exactly yesterday, I said, my deep voice dropping an aggressive octave. I passionately wanted to completely have a beautiful memorial service, you explicitly see, to absolutely pay my deep respects, but the exact pathology report directly from the exact night of the massive miscarriage. It completely does not actively mention a male fetus at all. I slowly unfolded the crisp paper. The incredibly loud rustling sound was the absolute only noise completely in the massive room. In absolute fact, I read confidently from the blank paper. It absolutely says the young patient was completely treated for a massively ruptured ovarian cyst. An incredibly painful medical condition, completely certainly. But absolutely not a pregnancy, and completely, definitely, absolutely not a baby boy proudly named Preston. I completely looked up. Massive whispers actively started to violently break out across the room. A wealthy man completely in the absolute back, a powerful banker I explicitly recognized, frowned completely and actively looked entirely at Preston. What exactly is he violently talking about, Preston? The banker demanded loudly. You actively told us the massive litigation risk was completely over. You completely told us the violent assault charge was entirely solid. Preston violently panicked. He looked desperately at Tiffany, who was completely shaking her head, violently and frantically. He completely looked aggressively at the wealthy investors who were entirely starting to completely back away. He is completely confused. Preston violently shouted, his voice completely cracking. I explicitly told you he is completely senile. He absolutely does not actively know what he is violently reading. That is highly likely a complete grocery list. He violently grabbed Tiffany's fragile arm incredibly roughly, almost violently dragging her entirely off her designer feet. Tiffany is incredibly tired. He announced violently to the completely shocked room. She absolutely needs to deeply rest. The massive emotional trauma. You completely understand. Dad, violently give me that absolute paper. He aggressively tried to violently snatch the fake paper completely from my steady hand, but I smoothly pulled it completely back. I folded it incredibly neatly and casually placed it completely back deep into my tailored pocket. Emotional trauma is an incredibly terrible thing, I said entirely coolly. It actively makes incredibly guilty people say and passionately do incredibly crazy things. Deeply get absolutely some rest, Tiffany. You completely look exactly like you have seen a violent ghost. Preston glared entirely at me with absolute, pure, incredibly intense hatred, but he absolutely could completely not do a single tiny thing. Not completely in front of the massive amounts of money in the room. He aggressively pulled Tiffany violently toward the massive kitchen door, entirely abandoning his absolute own incredibly expensive party. I stood completely alone exactly in the exact center of the massive room. And they were actively looking entirely at the massive door, exactly where Preston had violently fled with extreme, intense suspicion. I confidently raised my crystal glass entirely to the powerful banker who had aggressively asked the incredibly crucial question. The seared scallops are incredibly excellent, I said smoothly. But I would absolutely stay entirely away completely from the incredibly volatile investment portfolio completely, if I were exactly you. The massive corporate numbers are exactly as entirely imaginary as my fake grandson. I completely turned precisely on my heel and confidently walked incredibly directly toward the massive buffet table. The absolute real show was entirely, just aggressively beginning. The grandfather clock in the grand hallway chimed exactly 2 o'clock in the freezing morning. It was holding its breath. I sat quietly on the edge of the guest bed, in the pitch dark. I had not changed out of my expensive tuxedo. The crisp audio feed was crystal clear. It easily picked up the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the ticking of the clock. But then I clearly heard terrified voices. They were in the living room, right where I knew they would be sitting. Preston sounded incredibly drunk. His desperate words were slurring, running together in a pathetic stream of absolute panic. "He knows, Tiff, I am telling you he knows. Did you see the terrifying way he looked at you? Did you hear what he said about the medical report?" There was the sharp sound of heavy crystal glass clinking against a hard table. She sounded calculating. "He is guessing, Preston. He is throwing blind darts in the dark, desperately hoping to hit something. The medical report is buried. I paid the greedy nurse to shred the original hard copies. The digital file is encrypted. He has nothing, but he has the dates wrong. He said the cyst surgery was 2 days before the fall." "So what?" Tiffany snapped violently. "He is just a crazy old man who spent 2 years rotting in a concrete box. No one believes him at all. You saw the wealthy investors. They think he is losing his mind. Stop drinking and focus on the massive problem." I intently listened as the expensive leather sofa violently creaked. Preston was pacing the floor. I could imagine him profusely sweating, pulling at his expensive collar exactly like he did when he was a boy and had carelessly broken a window. "We desperately need more liquid cash," Preston said, his pathetic voice instantly dropping to a whisper. "The bridge loan from Nemesis Corporation. The weekly interest payment is due next week. I aggressively spent the massive principal entirely on the desperate crypto margin call. We are entirely underwater, Tiff. If we miss the payment, we absolutely lose the entire voting rights." I completely leaned forward in the pitch dark. This was exactly it, the absolute confession. "Then aggressively sell more shares," Tiffany casually said, exactly as if she were explicitly suggesting ordering cheap pizza. "Sell the Asian distribution arm. We absolutely have a massive offer entirely on the table." "I absolutely cannot," Preston groaned loudly. "That is the absolute core of the business. If I aggressively sell that, Dad explicitly has no say." Tiffany aggressively interrupted, her shrill voice violently rising. "Dad is absolutely a massive ghost. You are exactly the massive CEO. And carefully listen exactly to me, Preston. I incredibly need $50,000 completely by exactly Friday." "50,000? Preston choked loudly. "For exactly what?" "I completely just explicitly gave you 10 grand exactly last week." "Leo completely needs incredibly expensive things," Tiffany coldly said. Her sharp voice had entirely changed. It was completely no longer the warm voice of a loving wife. It was the incredibly cold voice of a massive blackmailer. The incredibly expensive nanny completely needs to be paid. The massively expensive private doctor completely needs to be paid. And I absolutely need private security. If this massive ship completely goes violently down, Preston, I am absolutely not going completely down with it. You aggressively better completely find the massive money. Or absolutely maybe I will explicitly actively take little Leo and completely go aggressively stay entirely with my massive brother for a long while. You absolutely know exactly how incredibly much the massive press would absolutely love a massive story. Exactly about a terrified single mother completely frantically fleeing a violently bankrupt CEO. Total, massive silence. The terrifying, massive threat aggressively hung completely in the heavy air, incredibly heavy and utterly suffocating. She was aggressively intentionally using the innocent child, absolutely not entirely as a precious son, but completely as an incredibly massive, valuable hostage. "Fine," Preston whispered, completely defeated. "I will explicitly call the massive corporate broker completely in the exact morning. I will aggressively actively sell the massive shares. Just absolutely just do explicitly, not incredibly leave." I slowly took the tiny earpiece completely out. My steady hand was slightly shaking. Absolutely not incredibly from deep fear, but completely from a massive, perfectly focused cold fury. They were aggressively going to violently actively dismantle my absolute entire life's massive work explicitly, to heavily strictly pay entirely for her incredibly massive greed and his incredibly massive, profound incompetence. The next freezing morning, I took a cheap yellow cab entirely to the completely massive south side of the massive city. Incredibly empty, massive brick factories, entirely with violently broken glass windows, completely stood perfectly, like massive dead skeletons entirely against the massively gray sky. I completely pulled my heavy coat exactly tight and aggressively walked completely directly into a dirty diner, perfectly called the Rusty Spoon. The completely stale air perfectly inside, intensely smelled completely of heavily burnt greasy coffee and heavily old duct tape. I explicitly walked exactly directly to the absolute exact far back corner. She aggressively flinched completely when a massive trucker explicitly demanded more hot coffee. I exactly patiently completely waited. When she finally walked perfectly to my tiny booth, she completely locked her tired eyes directly on mine. She completely gasped in absolute total terror. "Harlan," she completely whispered, "Oh God. I absolutely have exactly no money. Sit perfectly down, Sarah," I completely said quietly. She incredibly frantically checked exactly for her incredibly massive, violently angry manager, then perfectly slipped completely directly entirely into the incredibly sticky booth. Preston explicitly threatened exactly to entirely take full custody of Danny. She completely whispered exactly in pure fear. He absolutely destroyed my entire massive life completely because Tiffany aggressively set me perfectly up, exactly in a massive hotel room, exactly with an incredibly expensive actor. "I absolutely know," I completely whispered. "I know completely everything. I am absolutely deeply Nemesis Corporation." Sarah's perfectly wide, incredibly tired eyes perfectly snapped massively open, perfectly in total shock. I explicitly smoothly slid the incredibly massive Nemesis loan, exactly documents directly exactly across the dirty table, incredibly accompanied entirely by an incredibly massive, incredibly signed $50,000 cash check. "Quit this incredibly terrible job immediately today," I absolutely commanded smoothly. "You exactly will, incredibly carefully, totally testify perfectly in federal court. You absolutely are perfectly my new chief financial officer." She perfectly cried, totally heavily perfectly accepting the incredibly massive check. Exactly 2 incredibly total, exactly massive hours precisely later, I aggressively kicked perfectly open the massive, perfectly frosted, absolutely extremely, exactly, perfectly, massive glass doors completely directly, of the incredibly extremely incredibly massive completely absolute corporate boardroom, exactly located on the incredible completely exact, precisely 42nd massive floor. Preston explicitly froze in absolute terror. The completely extremely foreign, entirely absolute incredibly massive investors perfectly stared entirely directly at incredibly me. "Security." Preston violently screamed completely directly perfectly into exactly absolute the massive room. I absolutely ignored his perfectly exact, absolute pathetic, entirely total scream. I aggressively slammed exactly the incredibly massive signed incredibly exact absolute entirely exact proxy forms directly absolutely directly exactly on the table. I completely officially absolutely hold perfectly exact entirely absolute 51 exactly exact percent entirely of the incredibly absolute exact total massive voting totally power exactly absolute totally I absolute declared intensely loudly. The incredibly massive exact sale exactly absolute totally is completely absolute exactly cancelled. The foreign investors exactly quickly precisely walked exactly absolute exactly directly completely out. Preston absolutely smashed a incredibly exact heavy glass exactly directly against the massive wall in pure rage. Later that exact afternoon, Garrett and I exactly directly exactly paid an exact visit totally directly to Dr. The terrified doctor completely confessed entirely to the perfectly fake absolutely exact miscarriage. That evening at the massive gala, I perfectly exposed everything. The police arrested Preston and Tiffany on stage. The company was completely mine again. I rebuilt the Ford Foundation with Sarah as my CFO, entirely ensuring that justice always prevails. As I stood on the balcony overlooking the vast city below, the heavy rain finally stopped. The bruised, purple clouds slowly parted, allowing the first bright rays of the morning sun to wash over the gleaming glass skyline. For 2 long years in that dark concrete cell, I had meticulously dreamt of this exact moment. I had imagined the sheer intoxicating rush of total victory. But standing here now, with the empire firmly back in my grasp, The feeling was remarkably different. It was not triumph. It was an incredibly deep, profound sense of quiet peace. The toxic shadows that had infected my family were entirely gone, aggressively burned away by the harsh, absolute light of truth. We were finally free.